So the final evaluation point for circadian rhythms is by Brewer et al. 2010. So the piece of research that was conducted suggested that actually light wasn't the most important kind of synchronizing factor in circadian rhythm, and actually in fact it was temperature. So what would happen is that light would go in and trigger the SCN, but the SCN would then convert those neural messages, or those messages from light, into temperature. So it would actually, which would then go on to synchronize all the peripheral oscillators and synchronize the body. So actually it wasn't light, it was temperature synchronizing the circadian rhythm. And that's it. So it's obviously just an alternative explanation. The traditional explanation of circadian rhythms is that that light is the entraining factor, whereas actually temperature is now the thing that entrains the body. So that's circadian rhythms. And then we've got endogenous pacemakers. So if the research asked about endogenous pacemakers, you've got two pieces of research. The research I've just mentioned and this research I'm going to mention are all in the the cat book on page 164 and 165. So you can have a further look at these. So two pieces of supporting evidence, both fit quite nicely together, but they're also ones you can use individually. So De Corsi with the chipmunks, he found that when he lesioned the brain of the chipmunks, so he damaged the SCN, the part of the brain that should regulate the sleep-wake cycle, then released them out into wild. He found that a large number of them died. He went back to kind of trap them, and he found that a large number of them had been killed because they were awake when they should have been asleep, so that meant they made more noise and they were more vulnerable to predators and they were eaten. So that does suggest that the SCN does regulate our body. And obviously the strength of that is the fact that because we aren't able to do that kind of research on humans because it would be unethical, but it is ethical on animals, that we can be confident of cause and effect. The chipmunks slept absolutely fine, their bodies were regulated. However, when the SCN was damaged afterwards, so cause and effect, they were killed, and therefore suggests that the SCN does regulate the sleep-wake cycle, protecting animals. Of course, you could argue that we are measuring whether they died or not rather than actually their sleep-wake cycle. So you could argue there might be another reason that lesions in the SCN might lead to the animals being more vulnerable that wasn't to do with their sleep-wake cycle. So we can't be confident of cause and effect in that way. So you can balance it out. There's lots you can discuss there in your howevers. Got Ralph with the hamsters, who he bred mutant hamsters who had a circadian rhythm that was different from the traditional circadian rhythm in hamsters. He took the circadian rhythm out, the SCN out of the mutant hamsters, and he transplanted it into another hamster. And he found that the circadian rhythm of the hamster altered. So he bred them to the abnormal circadian rhythm of 20 hours, replaced a hamster that was on a 24-hour cycle with SCN with the 20-hour hamster cycle of SCN, and saw that the new hamsters, the transplanted brain hamsters, slept had a 20-hour circadian rhythm, not a 24-hour. So the key thing is you've got to link those both back. Or what does that show us? The exogenous light gapers didn't change, however the endogenous pacemakers did, and the sleep-wake cycle, the circadian rhythm, was altered. Let's have a look at the next one. So we've got practical application. So this is the one that you'll enjoy. Let me just refresh my memory. Yes, I've mentioned this one before, so you're already aware of Kelly and the fact that there's a practical application. So the fact there's endogenous pacemakers, the body clock, which keeps us regulated at certain times, and particularly for teenagers, so young people in education, their circadian rhythm is actually biologically, due to their endogenous pacemakers, is delayed compared to adult circadian rhythms. So they have found there's a 12% increase in academic progress and a 50% decrease in illness if they move the start of the school day forward to 10 o'clock. So that is a practical application of endogenous pacemakers, that internal body clock. Problem is, of course, they've got animal studies, so it's hard to extrapolate. 1 second. There we go. So we've added a little bit more detail to that. You wouldn't have to be expected to use all of these evaluation points, but of course if you're going to talk about the fact there's problems with animal studies, you've got to talk about the fact that there's issues with extrapolation. You've got to demonstrate the difference between animals and humans to be able to talk about that. Don't use all the examples, but you do want to refer to some of them. So animals and humans sleep in very different ways. So the sloths, they found that they sleep up to 16 hours, whereas obviously, so that would be the number of hours sleep that we would need, whereas humans need more like 8 hours sleep. So there's a different amount of animals need different amount of hours. There's also something called unihemispheric sleep, and this is done for, you can see this in dolphins and in other animals as well, where it's vital that the animal is always awake and conscious. So for dolphins, it's because of course they're swimming underwater, so they need to be careful, but it can also be to protect them from predators. It's that one hemisphere falls asleep at a time, so the left hemisphere will be asleep and the right hemisphere will be awake, and vice versa. So that's not something that humans do. When we fall asleep, both of our hemispheres fall asleep at the same time, so that's something that's different. And also the amount of REM and non-REM sleep that we have. So REM stands for rapid eye movement, and the next video that you'll see when we look at cycles of sleep within a 90-minute cycle, you'll know a little bit more about that, so don't panic, just store it for your memory. Platypus, 60% of their sleep is REM sleep, where there's rapid eye movement. In humans, that's 20 to 25% where your eyes move, and they do say that's when you dream. So there's a big difference there, so we can't compare. Humans have sleep disorders, whereas animals do not. So you could use any one of those, you don't have to use them all, just to illustrate that significant difference, and that's the difference between A2 and AS. Don't talk about animal ethics. If we can justify a reason for killing animals, then we're allowed to do it, which isn't very nice, but that's what it says in the ethical guidelines, so not something that you would gain marks for. And then we've got a contrast to alternative, which is the interactionist approach. Endogenous pacemakers suggest that the only thing that regulates our sleep is internal pacemakers, whereas actually there's a lot of research that suggests that it's an interaction between endogenous pacemakers and exogenous Zeitgebers, and you could refer back to some research that we've already looked at. Sifa, for example, with the cave studies, and the bunkers, whilst it did stay at a regular pace, it was at a 25-hour circadian rhythm, which does suggest that we do need light to keep it entrained to 24 hours, which fits with the external world around us. So there is that interaction between light and endogenous pacemakers and exogenous Zeitgebers. So your SCN and light, there's that interaction between the two, and that would be the best way to move forward, not individually just say it's one or the other, and that applies for both of them, so we've overlapped that one. Exogenous Zeitgebers, the piece of research that we've got is Campbell and Murphy, who demonstrated that there are that exogenous Zeitgebers can entrain light, so light can entrain any part of the body, and it can even entrain peripheral oscillators. So we have peripheral oscillators in lots of parts of our body: skin, little mini body clocks at the SCN entrained so that the whole of the body is awake and asleep at the same time. They've all synchronized with the brain. So we have them in the liver, we have them in the skin. The one that Campbell and Murphy capitalised on, experimented, tested, investigated, is the skin. And what they found is that they could entrain somebody's body clock by shining a bright light on the back of the knees. So they found that if they shone bright lights on the back of the knees, then the body clock would be entrained to a different circadian rhythm than the information coming in from the SCN. So it also works backwards. The peripheral oscillators can also entrain the SCN, but the key thing there is the exogenous Zeitgebers were able to entrain and change the body clock regardless of the internal body clock. So it wasn't the internal body clock setting the rhythm, it was the exogenous Zeitgebers. A confounding variable there. They argued that you couldn't just exclusively have the light shining on the back of the knee. They did suggest that that people also had the light, even though it was a darkened room, the light could still be caught and processed by the eye, and so that was actually what was entraining at the SCN rather than the skin, and it hasn't been replicated since. That obviously calls into question issues with reliability. If you wanted to, and this is the only time I'd recommend it, so we've got O, which is opposing evidence. You could use DeCourcy and the chipmunks and Ralph and the hamsters as a challenge for exogenous Zeitgebers. So a weakness of the theory is that there's opposing evidence. Normally we use supporting, but it's just as valid to use opposing. It's just it doesn't fit with my acronym of SPEC, SOPEC maybe. But if you didn't want to learn Murphy and Campbell, you could use de Courcy and the chipmunks and Ralph and the hamsters and just flip it the other way. You'd need to link it back to how it doesn't support exogenous sight gabers. Something that we have found is a practical application is that using exogenous sight gabers can control jet lag. And Burgess, who is in your cat book, on page 169, and there's lots of detail about the research, but ultimately what they found is using, they had continuous bright light, intermittent bright light and dim light, and they found the most effective way to entrain your body clock to, if you knew that you were travelling in a few days, you could use them in continuous bright light at the right times to shift your sleep-wake cycle 2 hours to the time zone that you would be in when you went to travel, so you would be less jet lagged when you arrived at your destination. So that's quite an interesting one. There we go. Once again, a problem, of course, with it. Even if you don't use de Courcy and the chipmunks, or if you use Campbell and Murphy instead, you can use the confounding variables issue. You can talk about animal studies, and of course, the key thing there is not just say issues with extrapolation. You've got to tell me what the issues are. So, why are animals and humans and their sleep wakes? Why can't they be used? Well, it's because their sleep wake cycles are significantly different. Unihemispheric sleep disorders, whatever it is that you want to mention. And again, the interactionist approach is exactly the same. If they ask you to describe and evaluate exogenous sight gabers, then they're arguing that exogenous sight gabers are the key thing, whereas actually you could argue that the best way to approach it is an interactionist approach. And you can talk about SEEF again with the cave studies and the 25 hours needing the light to entrain it. However, ultimately it did stick at 25 hours, so you can have a free running body clock, which means there's a body clock that's not regulated by exogenous sight gabers, and it still does set that time. So either way, it's not one or the other. They work in tandem, they work together, and they interact with each other, so it'd be the interactionist approach. And that is the end of all the information on circadian rhythms.